This discussion is dedicated to hybrid practice. Particularly, we're interested in talking about the arts in an interdisciplinary way and to look at practices. I mean, all the people that we have here today have a kind of maverick. They have very slippery practices. Their work melds multiple mediums, and they're interested in a lot of kind of hybrid discourses. But I was thinking about whether we wanted to define hybrid for the purpose of this talk, and I thought about it, and I think the best way to maybe define hybrid is to let these guys talk to you about their practice, and I think maybe we'll all come to our own conclusions as the talk goes. Now I'd like to introduce everyone. I guess I'll start with Alex, who is Alex Holt, who is a contemporary curator, and she is the co-director of Critical Animals Festival, which is part of This Is Not Art Festival in Newcastle, and the actual festival is dedicated, it's kind of a, would you say, a creative research symposium? Yep, got that right. And next we have Diego Ramirez. Diego is an artist who works with installation and video, and he also is a writer, and while those practices may seem separate, there's a lot of converging relationships between the films and work that he makes as well as the writing that he makes, but I'll let him tell you more about that later. Next we have John Butt. John is a contemporary artist who's shown at, who is about to show at BUS, so you guys should check that out in June, and he's shown at a variety of different places, including Strange Neighbour, Centre Pompidou, and 7th and C3 and many other places. I feel like I'd just be reading his CV, so I'll stop now. But he started 7th Gallery, which is on Gertrude Street, and 7th is about to be 20, is that correct? Which means he's been very active in artist-run circles for a while, and he, for the past 9.5 years, has been the director of C3 Contemporary Art Space. And finally, we have Daniel Jenach, who is a I guess you'd say musician and writer and producer. I think he's many different things. He's created works for Next Wave Festival, and he's worked with the MCA, and currently he is doing the sound for the performances at ACCA, the exhibition by Claire Lamb called Mother Holding Something Horrific. But I feel like I won't prattle on about everyone's amazing achievements because I'm sure they're going to be talking about them a little bit later. The first question that I'm going to ask everyone, and maybe I'll start with Alex, is to tell us a little bit more about, I guess, your conceptual interests and where your research is located at the moment.
So I came into contemporary art in a kind of circuitous way after studying a design degree and working as fashion designer. And I went to art school, and I kind of felt like I didn't know anything about contemporary art, and everything that I'd learned about design was not relevant. And since then, having realised that my interests in design and art are both about design and art concepts and the way that people communicate through their practices, but I'm not particularly interested in making myself. I think it's interesting to have a curatorial practice that is about understanding that that's where your interest is, and then communicating about other people's practices through that process. And so I think what I'm interested in terms of hybrid practice is in approaching contemporary arts through an interdisciplinary approach. So in my readings that I've put in the pamphlet, they're about approaches to interdisciplinary design thinking, and they give you ways of approaching interdisciplinary practice. So using a methodology that I think is quite important to be able to understand what other people's practices are about, and then give you a way to communicate in between practices, which I think is quite important, especially understanding that research is really key to that process, understanding that wherever you're positioned, if you're speaking to another practice that comes from a different pedagogy, that it's important to understand that trajectory so that you can find commonalities between you and your collaborators.
I'll just really quickly interject. So, Diego, would you like to tell us about some of your conceptual interests as well?
I can do that, Katie. Thank you. Well, as Katie said a moment ago, I work with video and pictures, and most of my work and my conceptual interests deal with the legacies of colonialism. And what I mean by that is images that in some way or the other communicate or establish a racial relation or sustain a dominant narrative or a form of power that is related to imperial expansion or the way the world is divided. But within that kind of like broad category of how we look at pictures, how we think about bodies, how we relate to others, I'm actually interested in the darker side of that. Not the politically dark side of that, but more the horrible, uncanny, kind of fantastical spaces that can happen within that. So for example, horror movies or monsters, myths, and imitating what Justin did a moment ago, I provided some readings, and I think they're a good portrait of my kind of interests. So things like Stuart Hall, H.P. Lovecraft, Roland Barthes, Julia Kristeva, Mean Girls, and more specifically, in regards to hybrid practice, I will say the hybridity in my practice takes place backstage. So most of my work is actually informed by what I write, even if it's about other people on my own writing. And for me, hybridity is when two things collide, but you can still distinguish where they actually come from. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Joanna, would you like to tell us about your conceptual interests?
Thank you, Katie. And thank you for your introductions. It must be hard to work out what to say when you're doing hybrid practice and you have to introduce everyone and everything they do. It's pretty long-winded. So I have a number of practices. I started here at RMIT in the late 90s studying sculpture and spatial practice. So I have a 20-something year continuing process of looking at the landscape. So that's my visual arts practice, which is primarily in photography, photomedia, sculpture, video, installation practice, drawing, object hood, all that kind of stuff. There's a few things there. Also, I'm a curator, so I have a very sort of straightforward curatorial practice, which is aligned with the gallery, and also off-site stuff and art fairs and whatever. I also, as the director of C3, I'm also, as an artist, I've kind of developing a new practice, which is hybrid, I suppose, which is why I'm here, which is kind of linking all those personal orbits in my life and my practice and trying to kind of reconcile that with being a gallery director and an arts worker and administrator and having two kids and working full-time plus the overtime plus the full-time practice plus the kids plus karate on the weekends and all that kind of jazz. So it's, you know, that thing's coming out of necessity, which I suppose hybridity is always about necessity. It's like having a set of things or set of materials or circumstances or trajectories that you have and they're all going crazy and haywire. So if you want to go and bring it together, you need to sort of think about how you can join them together. So that kind of last practice is one, a practicality where it's like, how can I do all these things and also have a sustainable art practice plus devote enough time to C3 in a really meaningful way, but also kind of think about a new way to be a director. Not that there's a new way to be a director, but it's thinking about how can I do projects and blend all those things together and not worry about those delineations anymore. So, because I think the delineations of curator, artist, director, arts worker are quite debilitating at times because there's expectations on time management and the expectations of what you can and can't do in those practices. So for me, that last one is more about letting go a bit, which is exciting.
Yes, my interest, or my maintained sort of interest in art, I think I stay interested in art mainly because it's not science and it's not philosophy. There are limits to science and limits to philosophy, and those fields are mainly limited by their methodological constraints, and art sort of isn't limited by its methodology. So, and yeah, science and philosophy are there to. There are different ways of knowing the world, and art is also a way to know the world, I guess. And my work is mainly to do with history, or a lot of the projects that I'm working on are kind of history projects in various ways, because history sort of encounters the limits of science, philosophy, and art, because history is an art and a science. Yeah, I'm interested in exploring the limits of different ways of knowing things, and art seems like a really good way to do that. Yeah, and I guess I'm a musician, so my history as a musician kind of informs the way I sort of explore those ideas. Yeah.
Thank you, and can I just apologise for the noise next door? There's a student study lounge there, and unfortunately we don't have very much control over the noise levels, and so I guess I might just ask, for the purpose of recording, that maybe everyone try and speak up as much as they can and try and ignore the rabble. Yeah, I know. It's clearly a recreation space. My next question to all the practitioners is going to be asking them about how they first began to work within multiple mediums or multiple schools of thought or multiple practices. I think, I don't know about you guys, but when I read about someone that is incredibly interchangeable, and they're working within multiple mediums and they're combining all of those mediums to incredible effect, my first thought was, how did they get from one to another? How did they start in art and move to music, or vice versa? How did they become a creative practitioner and then curator? I think it's definitely it's not unlike if you go to school to study to be a curator, for example, and you do an art history degree and then you jump straight into another degree and then you jump into a job. A lot of all of these practitioners, their career trajectory has not been linear, and so I think that definitely out of personal curiosity, I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about how those practices began to kind of converge. So Alex, I might jump to you real quick.
So I was working as a fashion designer, and I had to come back to Sydney to do a last subject of my course, and it was an elective on illustration, and it was run by Agatha Go-Snape, and during that elective it became quite clear through the conversations that we were having that I was much more interested in design concepts, and that had a really strong relationship with her practice than I was in the job that I was doing, which was drawing skirts that I'd never be able to fit into. So I went to art school, and while I was there, I kind of realised that I was much more interested in seeing the patterns that were emerging amongst my peers rather than making work on my own. So I'm not super interested in spending lots of time in a studio working on a project open-endedly. That a design methodology was something that I was much more interested in, but the ways that I could apply that methodology could come into play within a gallery context through a curatorial practice.
I actually do have a moment where I started writing, and it was actually a residency at Blindside. I was doing a studio residency, and I spent a month and a half there, just kind of like getting depressed and doing research and kind of hating everyone in my life. And so I did one work, I did a catalog, and I did an installation, and I feel ever since I've been doing that, like that has become the most for my practice. So if you guys ever have a chance to do the residency of anything similar, I definitely recommend it, because it can really help you establish that. And I actually did it after my honors degree, which is why I was depressed. Saying if you can do it right after finishing art school, I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
What about you, John? What project kind of made you think that maybe you had an expanded practice?
Well, I think when we were at art school here, we were always taught to be multidisciplinary. So for me, it's probably valuable to sort of separate being multidisciplinary to being hybrid, because I think a lot of artists these days, you use whatever material or media or discipline to talk about your idea. So I think for me, when I really started to focus on my ideas and what I really wanted to achieve in my art practice, the idea of hybridity became a bit more purposeful, because I just sort of always used multimedia, all those different things. Like Peter Crypto's in my lecture, who's just like, even your screw that you use that's hidden should talk about your artwork. So all the materiality, all the hidden things, all the things in the gallery, and all they all co-join with that. But when I started, I suppose I've got a couple of hybrid heroes, Sarah Coast and Benjamin Woods, and I've had a very long conversation with Ben Woods about what it means to be an artist, and I think that discussion has probably been the most valuable for me in terms of working out my practice and also understanding the true nature of a hybrid practice, because when he starts talking to me things about having a practice that's invisible, or doing things that you don't exhibit, or working outside of a format, then you can start to really kind of focus more on your own personal desires with your practice, and then you can just forget about all the kind of delineations between that and move towards it. So I remember when I was 13, I did a work experience with my cousin, who was an artist, and we went to Colac and smoked joints and listened to Colac death metal and set fire to trees and made all these kind of, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. And he was like a hybrid artist, and he still is. He really lives his life like that, but he would never think of himself as that. It was just that introduction to anything can create and work with your ideas. So I suppose for me, looking at my role at C3 and saying to myself, I can be an artist and maker in this role, which is traditionally an arts administration role, was a real moment where I go, I can do this. So I started doing lots of projects with Simon McEwen. Some of you may know him. He's a fantastic artist, painter, metalworker extraordinaire, but we used to do a lot of relational projects where we'd set up exhibitions in C3, like Copy Shop, where we made a fake Dinkum's coffee lounge in the gallery, and we got all these artists to come as employees, and they worked as employees, and we kind of said to them, you're not allowed to really tell the audience whether you're an artist or a worker. So people came in and got photocopying done at the gallery, quite cheaply. But we also had really long conversations with people who could start to see that there was some sort of strange thing going on here that wasn't quite what it appeared. So I could kind of be a director and say, okay, we're going to curate this project, we're going to do this. I'd work with the artist. One of the things I really like doing is connecting people together. I'm like a matchmaker for artists and ideas, so I really like putting people who have never worked together, and I think that's a really interesting way to kind of get hybridity as well, because, people who have never worked together can really do some, but they socially get along, they can do really great stuff. So we started doing all these projects, which really just became these ideas that we'd manipulate people, and we'd manipulate the artists, and we'd manipulate the audience in really interesting and generous ways to not really, and also to transgress the delineations, which I keep talking about delineations. I think it's really, the art world is quite conservative in a lot of aspects, that it expects you to do certain things as a practitioner. So you're supposed, if you're at a commercial gallery, you're supposed to paint your pictures like this because they sell. Or if you're an experimental artist, you're supposed to experiment like this. So, there's, I think there's a lot of expectations on people to have very precise or labelled practices, and for my visual arts practice, I'd always lose track or work on ideas which I felt compelled to work with, and I was always criticised, well, you don't sit still, or you're not successful because you don't do the same thing all the time, or you haven't got this lineage of work which is a history. I'm like, well, why am I doing this? What I really want to get out of being an artist is answering questions. So when I really made that decision of, fuck the whole convention of having to do what we're supposed to do, then this became a lot easier and more instinctual, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess my first sort of encounters with the world outside of the place that I grew up and the TV was sort of punk music, and at the time that I was kind of starting to become aware, I guess, of various underground movements. DIY culture was pretty established, and I guess through the ethos of DIY, I just became interested in developing the confidence and the skills to just do whatever I kind of wanted to do. I always sort of through really attaching myself to the DIY ethos, and I learned how to build radio transmitters and skateboard ramps and I don't know, whatever, just stupid shit. But I always had a broad sort of engagement with heaps of different things, sort of through I guess the philosophy that comes out of DIY culture, which is you can just figure out how to do it yourself. So when I started making art, it just sort of seemed like a natural thing to do after being immersed in that kind of stuff.
Thanks, guys. I think I'm going to start to ask some people some more specific questions that I have. And thinking about the idea of hybridity, the idea of not just sort of dabbling in one area or another, but being committed to a interdisciplinary research and being committed to projects that might not fit within a lot of constraints that as John said, art industry can often place on a practitioner. I thought that a nice thing to chat about at the moment would be to talk to Alex about the festival that she's co-producing at the moment, Critical Animals, because in a lot of ways, if I had some idea of an imaginary hybrid practitioner, I almost think one of the sort of ideal spaces maybe for them to be working with is Critical Animals. And so for those of you that don't know much about it, I thought I'd ask Alex to tell us.
So Critical Animals is held in Newcastle over the September-October long weekend every year, and it's a part of This Is Not Art Festival, which is originally aiming to activate Newcastle as a space of culture. And Critical Animals was a breakout from previous festivals that had existed within This Is Not Art. And it was conceived as a breakaway from the National Young Writers Festival and Crack Theatre Festival as a way to incorporate visual arts within the festival. but understanding that there were such strong linkages to writing and performance within the festival that it was important to maintain those links to foster a new cohort coming through in a different kind of strand. So the festival, so Critical Animals has always incorporated written and performance work, but it's reached out towards the visual arts community and offers a space where visual arts practitioners can explore the theoretical side of their practice as well as showing work. So a key component of the festival is all of the panel discussions and the writers' programs that exist within the festival, as well as a main exhibition that's held at the Lockup Contemporary Art Space. So the panel discussions and exhibition kind of work into different kind of ways, which is quite key to the ongoing success of the festival. So the Lockup is a really great contemporary art space that shows established artists in a really innovative program that makes great contemporary art available to a regional audience. And our festival is programmed in the Lockup Art Space in their public programs area. And with our panel discussions, we can kind of do whatever we want. They're there for just the weekend, and you can kind of just go rogue with it, which means that really experimental practices and performances can happen alongside practices that are more established and can exist within that art space for the following month. So it also gives practitioners the opportunity practitioners from really differing points in their career trajectory to meet and engage with one another about the similarities of their practices and how those practices can be developed. It also gives early career visual artists the opportunity to talk to people who are from more of a theoretical and criticism kind of background about their practices, which I think is really important in terms of getting people who mainly have a practice that is about making to be speaking to people who are interested in makers but don't want to be doing that themselves. So putting those people together at that really critical point in their careers that is kind of left out by art schools because they exist in their own special bubble, which is really important for people's practices to develop, but there's this kind of gap that happens once you leave the academy. You're not with your peers. You've got to find your own studio space. Where do you go then for crits? Who do you talk to? How do you begin to have those conversations with people who are not also makers?
And just as a bit of advertising, if you are interested in Critical Animals, there is a web link to their website in the little reader. I guess I might interject that I made this, and maybe it's kind of lame, but maybe it's kind of great, and it's just a little synopsis of the project. But it's also got, which I think is important, a bio of each of these guys. So if you hear stuff that you think is really fascinating and then can't remember their name or where to find them online, it's all here. But also at the back, I asked each of our panel speakers to contribute some texts that were really formative in their career and that maybe somewhat relate to hybrid practice, but not necessarily. And there's also some general texts about practice and research. So you might find them interesting. Also, just for the people in the corridor, we do actually have a bunch of extra chairs over here and some more ledge space. So if you do want to come through, you're welcome to. If you're fine there, that's totally fine too. But you're welcome to come on through. Okay, I guess my next question, I'd like to chat to Diego about a project that he did at, it was screened at Acme, but it also took place at Mars Art Gallery as well. It was called Postcard Exotica. And one of the reasons why I'm really curious about this project as a kind of crucial project in Diego's career is because I saw him building this film, but also alongside the film building a body of critical research that took the form of writing, but also the actual art project itself took the form of a delegated performance as well. And it's kind of curious to see one project that has so many different facets. And it was, in a way, to me, almost like a durational project because it happened over a longer period of time. And so I just thought I'd ask Diego to tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe why exploring different avenues for one idea was particularly important for you.
I suppose for example, with a work like that, we have maybe 5 different types of writing, because the first stage of that work was actually writing a proposal to the council, which was what actually enabled me to realize the video, because they were the ones who funded the work. So that was important because I needed the resources, and well, I guess that's a type of writing that everyone is probably familiar with. The other one was scripting. Scripting in a video like that is kind of like the backbone of the work. Like, if you don't script that properly, it's just not going to work. Which relates to delegating the performance, because those were the instructions that the actors had to realize the actions that they had to make my video. And finally, the critical writing, I think, as an artist, there's a lot of stuff that people probably research in their studio, and if you don't write it, it just evaporates. I think that art by itself is a valuable form of discursive knowledge. Like, when people make artworks, it's the same as writing an essay, but then again, not everything gets into the work. And the other reason, which is not important for me, but it has been advantageous, is when an artist writes, they're kind of leaving behind an evidence of the things that they were thinking about, the research that they were looking at. So in a way, it validates the work, which, that's very problematic. But if you write as an artist and in some way have a window into the kind of research that you have in the studio, it's actually quite advantageous. And if someone looks down on you, you can always just go back to your writing and say, like, oh, I actually do have something valuable in me. It's kind of, I did the work, I showed it, I did the writing. It's the studio becomes like a safer place. So I think those were the reasons why I probably engaged in those forms of writing, I think. And it's also automatic. Like, I wasn't actually thinking of why I was doing any of that. This is like an automatic thing, which, I guess that's what artists do. Like, someone tickles you and you laugh, it's...
Just to ask you a further sort of question. So to give you guys some context, the film Postcard Exotica was screened at Acme, and then it was restaged at Mars. But something I'm really curious about, Diego did a delegated performance. So there was an actor who had also been in the film performing at Mars on the opening night, and it was the most incredibly uncanny, kind of powerful experience, looking up at the screen and seeing this actor and turning and realizing they were standing next to you in the gallery. And I think it's a very considered choice for an artist to make, and also Diego being known as being present in most of his previous films, I thought it was a really interesting choice that you made to kind of take on the role of facilitator or as well. And so I thought I'd ask you about that.
Well, that guy, it's funny because he was kind of like a better looking version of me, so I basically casted an ideal version of myself. He does get a lot of screen time in the video. I don't know why. I mean, I wasn't really a facilitator because he was, at the end of the day, he was working for what I was doing. I mean, when I made that video, I did help a lot of, I was probably the first role that a lot of people got. And you know, I was reconstructing postcards from the early 20th century, and they were like Mexican stereotypes, so I casted people from diverse backgrounds, as we say. So, you know, for a lot of them, like, you know, they didn't know proper English, so they had like really thick accents, so they will never get like a proper role. And that was kind of like a good thing for them. I remember one of them had like I think he had like a criminal record, and he had like all these tattoos, and I was like, oh, fuck. But I mean, I casted him, and then he got all these acting jobs after that. So it is, I suppose I was facilitating that, but at the end of the day, I didn't see my role in that way, because I wasn't enabling something, I was more making something happen. And the particular decision of having the actor there, I suppose it's just a performance that works on two different levels, because when you perform for the camera, you know you're doing you know, something for the screen. So it's a scripted action, but it gets a lot of editing. So I just wanted to have like a real-time kind of action that related to the video, but it wasn't the same, which is probably the most ambiguous response that I can think of to that question. But yeah.
Thanks, Diego. Now I've got a question for John, but just to give you guys some context, over the past 3 years, C3 has had a project where they've held a fundraiser, which is obviously not unusual for artist-run spaces, but specifically they had a fundraiser that each year dealt with a thematic or conceptual concern, usually interrogating a system within the art world. So I think the first one was Faux Museum, if that's correct, and then there was Faux Fair, and then Faux Studio. So this has been a long, I guess in a way, from what I see, a long time kind of concern of yours, looking at ecologies of labour within the art worlds and different systems within the art world. But I have a burning question to ask you, and that's one of the first things I ever experienced at C3 that I really remembered was going to the Melbourne Art Fair in 2014 and being hugely, hugely disappointed by most of the commercial galleries' contributions, and then stepping into C3's project space and just leaving. It was a collaboration between Sarah Crowest and Benjamin Woods, and just leaving really profoundly affected by this kind of performative and discursive kind of project. And it, you know, for an art fair, it was quite a bold move, and I'm really curious about that. So could you tell us a little bit more?
I didn't expect that question. I was thinking about something else. That's like one of my favourite ever things I've ever done for C3. There's a lot of those, but that was good. We were invited by the Melbourne Art Foundation we've done the art fair project spaces a couple of times. There's always really amazing galleries like Gertrude and CCP and Box Copy were there, and others. And it's like the matchmaking I was talking about. Often when I curate people, I mean, I'm very interested not in their works, but their souls or their personalities, who they are, how they connect to each other. I really like to connect, make links. And Ben and Sarah are just two really great people who are orbiting around my life at that stage. And they always wanted to work with each other, but their practices are very different. And they was like, this will never happen. And I said, no, it's going to happen, let's do it. So I sort of said, do you guys want to work together with this thing, and let's do this project about an art fair. So rather than make work, because the first time we did the art fair, we had Jonas Raponen, who's another amazing hybrid practitioner, printmaker, sculptor, person, Facebook personality, ex-cult member. He's if you don't know Jonas, you've got to look his practice, he's incredible. But we had sort of traditional response, which was work on the walls. We had Oscar Yanez, amazing painter who loves bad paintings. That's his style. He loves to do bad painting. And we sort of did that, and we thought, well, this experience is really interesting. You have 30,000 people come through, and oh yeah, look, they look at this, and they tick off these things. And for us, it wasn't a very. We actually wanted to do the copy shop thing at the art fair, and they said no, you can't do that because it was going to be too difficult apparently, and they wanted commodity. They wanted a thing for sale and the collectors to come in, and we're like, well, we don't really work like that. So we did the first one, and it was really good to support those artists because they actually got some amazing results from that fair. But we were kind of a bit like, oh, we really wanted to do something that was a bit about that process of the art fair and the commodity world and the commercial world and how people engage with it and what, the idea of a thing or multiple things is. So we spoke to Ben and Sarah, and they said, well, let's just do the art fair. So let's make a fancy table and let's have chocolates, which were these amazing sculptures. We have business cards, we have the fancy chair, we had the coat rack, we had all the things that an art fair stall should have, but it was all really pretty wildly extrapolated from that. And really that was, Sarah had all the shiny paintings wrapped up, so had shiny little goldy glittery things, and Sarah just found everything that was shiny in her studio, and so let's just whack everything that glitters and looks like gold into this space. So it's about wealth and money. And Ben was like, well, he's a very, I don't know if you know Ben Woods, but he's a very gentle person, and he was like, well, I'd like to also engage with people. So he made these structures that were structures that people could hold and get into really weird, awkward positions. And so people come in and say, oh, how much is this? And I go, well, actually it's free, but have a hold of it. And then hold it, and then we'd say, well, can you come over here and you hold this? And we were like, I just set the space. It's pretty hardcore if you've ever done a art fair there. It's like 30,000 people come at you. It's intense. And you're there from 8 in the morning to 10 at night or whatever. And so we thought, well, let's just play with this. So rather than be the director that stood at the front there and kind of went, oh yeah, here's the business card of the artist, and yeah, we really like to support them. We were like, let's just play with people a bit. So my role was really to confuse people as much as possible, and also bring people into the space and give them things and make them feel that they could become a part of the work without this kind of sense of performance. So, and this is my discussion that I have with Ben a lot, is about discussion is the work. So talking about works or talking about how things happen or how we can engage people is actually the work itself. It's the sort of core part of that work. So we had, there's great photos. I think Betra, who's in here somewhere, some fantastic photos of you guys getting stuck in those objects. And, there was always other things that people, it became an Instagram thing for people to get stuck in Ben's objects and then photograph yourself in this bit of wood. But it was, it wasn't really taking piss of the art world. We were kind of just the art fair, we were looking at the sort of tropes of the art fair. So the art fair themselves they really engage with it because they're like, yeah, this is kind of funny, and we know it's not a derogative aspect. It's just looking at it, and so they were kind of pleased with that. So that project, and there's other things that happened out of that project for Sarah, and the wearing of her outfit, her paintings, the strap-on paintings, which is already beginning, but that was kind of really took off from there. So yeah, that was a great project.
Thanks, John. I feel like I'm actually just asking every panel speaker to tell me about all the favourite projects that I have of theirs. But this next project of Daniel's, I saw at Next Wave Festival last year, and it completely blew me away. I was trying to do as much of Next Wave as I could, in a row, which is very durational and exhausting, and I saw A97 at Acme, and I guess you've described it as an opera before, and it had a video component. There was a narrative about a computer that simulated an archive, and the plot itself is convoluted, so I might not describe that to you now, but it involved live narration, live sound, a dancer in front of a green screen, and video, and was the most sensory kind of haunting. It was just one of those performances that stays with you for a really long time afterwards, and I know that you would have developed it in quite a concentrated way as part of Next Wave, and so I thought that maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you. A97 was kind of it was motivated by like basically two things that sort of had been that kept on coming up in my mind, I guess, around the time that Tony Abbott was voted in as Prime Minister. One of his first gestures in Parliament was to correct what he saw as a bias against colonials in the history curriculum for primary school age children. And I was like, yeah, kind of amazed that that was one of the like very first things that he did in office. I guess probably because it's one of the easiest things to do, but it was kind of alarming to see that. And at the same time, I just remember like a lot of people like sort of crying on Facebook, like, how can these things happen in 2013 or whatever year it was? And so I guess a question came up in my mind that is kind of loosely linked, I guess, is that I was interested in trying to find out like how important history is to informing people's like subject positions as like people in the world, political people in the world. And I was also interested in looking at like what it is that gives people like such faith in historical progress that they can sort of say like, why should this particular thing happen in 2000 and whatever. So it's like, what is the difference between 1 year and another? And so yeah, A97 was kind of a weird history project in which I sort of built a narrative around making comparisons between the present and 1997 to sort of see what was different and what had changed. Like one of the key narratives was like Pauline Hanson's sort of reintegration into politics, and sort of it was pretty clear to me that she was going to get a seat in Parliament again, and so like I looked at like sort of materials from 1997 about things that she'd said that are just like completely baffling, but people have short memories about that kind of thing. So so A97 was really sort of motivated by like doing research into the philosophy of history and the mechanics of history, and thinking about time more broadly. I guess it's a sci-fi narrative, so there's like a kind of like a sci-fi thing happening. And so the process, I guess, started with me like looking at the concerns that I had around history and trying to answer a number of questions that I had. And so I guess the main question was, where does this faith in historical progress come from? Because if you look at now and 1997, in some ways there's been no progress at all, but in other ways there's been like a little bit of progress, but not enough to suggest that sort of saying how can something happen in X year is a sort of helpful like way to think about the political position that we're in. I wanted to answer that question because I had the feeling that this faith in historical progress is kind of paralyzing and sort of takes agency away from people's sort of ability to engage with the present, just because people can kind of imagine that things are going to get better in some way. So I tried to make an artwork that could kind of like could kind of problematize that idea of historical progress, but through a kind of fantastical narrative, and also be a way that people could just sort of think about 1997 and their memories of it and their experience of it, or learn some things about that year, because it was a pretty big and interesting year. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to open this question. Actually, I was about to say I'm going to open this question up to the whole panel, but I think I want to start with Alex again. Alex and I had an interesting conversation just this afternoon about what hybrid practice is and maybe some of the issues or concerns that can arise within this particular discourse. And I think that some of the ideas that Alex was interrogating or provoking were really fascinating, and I think everyone in the audience might be interested to hear a little bit more about those.
So this conversation started with Katie asking me what my thoughts about hybrid practice were, and my immediate response was, I'm not sure how I feel about that term. And I said that because I am interested in interdisciplinary approaches to practice, and I think that way of phrasing it gives a good understanding that there needs to be engagement with multiple practices on their own terms. There needs to be a really strong understanding of a historical lineage and a contemporary understanding of whatever field that you're talking about, and by understanding where a stream has come from, then you're better able to deal with it on its own terms, rather than being quite superficial in your approach to how you work with another field. So I think that as a secondary cultural producer, that's most important, because you're working with other people's practices, and so the stakes are kind of higher in order to be respectful of other people's practices. I think, as a curator, you need to be aware that your role is to work with people on the terms of their own practice. So that involves really actively listening to people, but also understanding where their work fits into a lineage and how that's positioned amongst its peers. And I think that's where an interdisciplinary approach is really useful.
Thank you. I think it was really interesting to hear that. I've just realised that when we first started this talk, I was intending to give you guys a little bit more of a context on this program, and clearly I was so excited about talking about hybrid practice that I kind of zoomed through it. But just for those of you that maybe haven't been involved with RMIT Link Arts and Culture before, or have never been to this gallery first site before, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about that really quickly. RMIT Link Arts and Culture is an organisation within RMIT University, obviously, and we run projects that sometimes are arts engagement projects, sometimes they're professional development for artists kind of projects, and the key kind of aim is to do with supporting practitioners to gain the industry skills that they need, and to kind of challenge them to maybe explore areas that they haven't worked with before. And Critical itself, it came out of, it was originally as a part of I was about to say 1916 instead of 2016 after Daniel's conversation. It happened last year in 2016, and it was a writing project, and we had 18 students produce an amazing body of writing, which will be launched soon. This year we wanted to have a more hybrid approach to writing, to discourse, to arts practice, and so that's one of the reasons why I felt that this particular discussion was a great way of beginning the project, because the project is inherently it's an ongoing discussion. There are about roughly 8 to 10 panel talks that will happen throughout between now and the end of the year, and they'll all be thematic. So, for example, the next talk that we're having is on spatiality in criticism and ideas around place. And relations to space, both physical and virtual, and that's with artist Zoe Bastin, public artist, I guess she's an artist, but she works within the public art sector, Claire McCracken, and then the team from an organisation called Parallel Space for Thinking, who come from an architecture background, but are interested in a lot of different approaches to criticism and relating to space. And so just quickly before I ask a couple more questions, if anyone is interested in coming along to any of the future panel talks, there'll be events online and also on Facebook. But if anyone is interested in if anyone is an RMIT student specifically and is interested in being involved in the critical program, it will also take the place of practical workshops where we'll be looking at, sometimes it might be kind of like a book club, looking at critical art texts and locating them in the world, but also potentially bringing the writing that you're working on to those workshops. And when I say writing, it's very broad. This whole aim of this project is for writers to feel like maybe they can enter the visual arts world, for curators to begin writing, for artists to feel confident writing. It's kind of about ensuring that people from any discipline can bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to critical writing, and so you can also just sort of bring proposals you're writing for exhibitions or artist statements, and it'll kind of be a supportive network, because critical ultimately is a ongoing network, which kind of gives us a chance to kind of focus on some amazing research that's coming out of the broader Melbourne arts community. I guess I do have a super cheesy question, and I feel like it's the kind of thing that's said in like Year 12 professional development discussions, but I'm really curious whether, I think as a young artist it can be quite intimidating working within different mediums and feeling confident to be able to call yourself both a writer, an artist, or a curator, and it can be a kind of wild ride trying to find practitioners that inspire you, and knowing, you know, if you look at something like a funding application, you're often asked to tick a box as to whether you're an artist or a writer or a curator, and then you're asked to tick a box as to whether you're emerging, mid-career, or established, and there are a lot of kind of boxes that artists and practitioners are supposedly meant to fit in. And so my long-winded question is, I'd like to know whether the panel has any advice for young practitioners that are maybe working within multiple fields but are still gaining the sort of confidence to kind of think about their practice as a kind of converging area. I might ask Diego next.
I would say, I think the action itself is what, not that it gives you confidence, but it gives you, it propels you forward. For example, I was thinking about what Justine just said, and I was considering how that works in relation to writing, because the way I think, whenever I write a review or catalog essay for another artist, the benefit that I get from that is that they function as an index, and so each one of them kind of expands into different points that allows me to, to learn, but also to keep going forward intellectually and in practice. And when I am entertained doing that, I just don't give a fuck what anyone else thinks or what anyone else says. And, if someone says something to me, I'm like, well, up your ass, dude. Like, but, it's being busy and doing shit that allows me to think like that, which is another benefit of writing, because there's so much dead time in an arts practice that writing allows you to fill in, It's kind of, you can write 8, 12 catalog essays, but you can make like 12 artworks, unless. Yeah, I guess you can, but it's, it's a good way to remain active. So I will say, yeah, like it's the act itself that propels people forward. And I can think of other people that I know that do that. It's just not about confidence, I don't think. It's more about pushing forward, having an attitude.
John, having seen many artists, I can't even imagine how many artists, if you think of all of the people that have shown at 7th and then all of the people that have shown at C3, it's a big number, but obviously you have not only maintained your own practice and kind of interrogated your own practice by working in different fields, you've also supported artists when they're building their exhibitions. And so I feel like maybe you might have a particularly interesting perspective on maybe what an artist could kind of do to build their confidence as a hybrid practitioner, or just whether you have any advice.
Well, I think Diego's comment's really true. It's like, don't give a fuck what people say or expect of you, because, I mean, I don't want to give cheesy answers to your cheesy question, but it's your practice. You can do whatever you want. There's no rules. One of the things, like I would say, don't overthink it. I mean, when someone said, "Oh, you're on the hybrid practice panel. Oh, you're a hybrid artist now." I was like, "Oh, I must be." It's like those delineations. While I understand, I totally get where you're coming from with talking about hybridity. It's not. I don't think it's a difficult thing, because what does that really mean? I mean, for me, all the artists I know who are making it, just the ones who are really probably truly hybrid, are just kind of working at the edge of contemporary art. So their practices are a culmination of what's come before them, their own desires on what to make. So it's not like, don't worry about the act of being it, just do it. And also what Diego, like, you got to do, just like keep making mistakes. Don't worry about the mistakes, because they're the things that teach you the most. Also spend time in your space. Get out of the art world. My reading list is about science fiction. I think everyone here is really into sci-fi. But I've done did a project where I decided to only read science fiction for 2 years in order to look at my landscape practice, which kind of sounds odd, but my landscape practice is about matter and phenomena as landscapes, so how we experience physically and intellectually and emotionally the landscape. And, all the art text I read, I kept falling asleep reading these things, because they just weren't giving anything to my practice. They were just talking about what other people have done, which is very valuable in some instances. But, science fiction hard science fiction, like people who are quantum physicists who know what they're talking about all this really weird shit about molecules and people. That gave me so much more, going outside the art world gave me a lot more information. But I think, the advice thing is, don't really try to worry about classifications, or don't worry about confidence so much, because confidence is something that happens over a number of years as a practitioner. So, and also, Katie will see this soon. When I'm an artist, I'm really nervous, like a total nervous Nelly. I get to the show and I have like 50-something. This is my 55th exhibition or something, and I'm shit scared beforehand. It doesn't go away ever. So, because you're putting your heart on a little platter and serving it up for lunch for people to sort of eat and criticise. So don't get hung up about that, because it will always be there. You need to really focus on, particularly if you want to talk about this hybridity, you really need to focus on the articulation of your practice and what you're really trying to say, and how the things you do really respond to that. So just get better at saying things rather than being a practitioner. I don't know. I could rattle on for days about advice for artists.
Yeah, I'd probably say I think it's important to know what you want to say. That's a funny way to say that sentence, because it was so slow. But yeah, I don't think I've really had a problem having a hybrid practice, because I've sort of concentrated more on what in particular that I want to say, and why I want to say it, and so how I'm saying it hasn't really been an issue for me. So yeah, it was really important for me early on to sort of do the work in sort of knowing why I'm doing it. Yeah, and if you know that, it's quite easy to sort of convince people to support you because it's kind of clear then. Yeah.
In a tick, I might actually begin to open up questions to the audience. If anyone does have any questions, be warned, if no one has any questions, I have lots that I'll continue to ask, but I think it'd be far more interesting if we spoke to some people in the audience. I'm just thinking that I don't think our microphone is going to cope with going out into the audience. Yeah, no one wants to experience that. So does anyone have any questions for the practitioners, either about their own particular practice or more about some of the things that we've spoken about today? Does anyone?
I have a question for John, if it's all right.
You can actually,
You can reach it.
You'll probably be able to hear me anyway. So just while I develop my own practice, I'm sort of noticing certain frameworks that have appeared that I may or may not feel comfortable with. And one of the really interesting things that you spoke about was your conversation with Ben about an invisible practice that happens almost amazingly or magically. It manifests independently from institutions. It almost happens in privacy. I think the economy of status is kind of like the semio-capitalist version of the value of gold. And I think the term curator is one of the most interesting things. It's like this really old school museological term, carries all this historical and etymological baggage with it. As I understand it, and also Daniel, you were talking about Tony Abbott and some of his misguided policies. Sometimes we talk about them like they're past tense. They're all still going. I had a meeting this morning about what's happening in terms of sessional teaching in universities. In the next couple of years, it will probably cost about $100,000 to have a fine art degree. That's going to really shift what culture actually looks like. In fact, you might even say also there's policies to do with the allocation of funding and stuff. We've been argumenting and augmenting that sort of conversation since Tony Abbott was in that position. I believe he's still in power, but he had to be sort of removed publicly because he's unelectable, because he's a dickhead. I mean, it's, you know, like, it's true. I think even people who like him might say that. I think he even might. I think if he was in the room, he'd go, yeah, I know, right. So the curator, in a sense, refers to the institution, which I believe sort of co-opts the artist's work, and the institution is a capitalist function. It is automatically self-referential. But you were talking about this idea of sort of like working quite privately. And in terms of working with the material of bringing things together, yeah, I was wondering if you could expand a bit on some ideas about how that model might progress once the institution is completely nihilistic.
I think it's a really good question, actually. Look, artist-run initiatives are a really great vehicle for this kind of work. And C3, even though we're in this flash building with lots of assistance from the comment, we're still an RE. And my CEO, our remit is to work with artists. As a curator, I'm lucky because I'm an artist first and foremost. So everything I do at C3 is based around what I would want as an artist. And that's my prime directive. And I think artists who have worked with me would understand that's pretty evident. So, every time I think about a space or even building the space or writing text or whatever, it's like, what would I want? What would my artist friends want? How do we want to articulate these things? So I'm lucky, I'm very lucky in that we have a space that can support that. There's a work we're doing at the moment with Testing Grounds, which is the Annabelle Lacroix, an active showing, which is coming up. If you guys don't know about it, it's a really great project happening opening on May 17th. We've actually moved our opening for the first time in history just because ours is on the same night, so we want to go to it. And we're doing a project which I'm working with Ben, and we started this discussion a long time ago about practice, non-practice, or visible practice, and how that can be articulated through an institutional space or a gallery space, whatever. He's not actually making work at the moment at all. He's yoga training and doing all those other things. But within that, has a very ongoing dialogue in his own practice in his own space. So he swims every day, and we were talking about, so when I said, come and let's do this project together, and me as the gallery director, because they asked the galleries to provide a work, I went, I'm going to make a work. And as my own, as an artist myself, so it kind of sounds nepotistic, but it's not. It's actually based on my intimate knowledge of the space and the convent, and why we're trying to make work there. And the idea that we talked with Ben was, look, if you have a practice that's invisible, what do you do with it? How does a space actually operate with that? And there's no answer to that actually. It's more about personal choice. And I think with my advice I was talking to before, your personal choice should be about, and what you said about you've got to know what you want to say. That's the bottom line. Like, what do you want to say as an artist? How are you going to say that? What's the vehicle for that message? For us, the discussion that I'm having with Ben, which is a 3-year talk, and I'm fiddling with this rock at the moment, which I picked up on the walk, the first walk. I had a meeting with Ben, and we talked about this project, and we said, what do you want to do? And I'm not making work. How do we show you're not making work? Because we have to provide a work for the publication and a work for the exhibition space. So our discussion was on how do we actually provide a non-work or an invisible work to a project like this, which is really important to promote the idea of what we're going to do. So we just talked about the discussion was the work, and the work started that moment, like that second that we started talking. And this rock's part of it. It's in my pocket every day. It's been there for 3 months now, and he's got one as well. And there's other artists that use the idea of work in pockets, like Jesse's. Like I know you sort of, and when you're invigilating an Aki, you were part of that. But this is more about site, and like the site where we started making the work. So I'm carrying Ben's invisible work sort of associated with this rock, or his rock, or discussion. In the publication, they asked us to give notes about C3. We gave Ben's work to them as the publication. So rather than giving the publication information about the gallery, we gave them the invisible work. And so the 4 pages we have has text in it and an image, which is really obscure, of him. I'm not going to give it away. It's really great work. So it's just about challenging or just negotiating between us how we actually can make that happen. So does that all answer?
It does. I did something, I curated. I didn't curate it, just for want of a better word, something with Ben in it. And I said, I don't want you to make anything. I just actually want you to collect a few things here in your studio, like the shittest things you've got here, and just maybe use that. And we'll show some not art. Yeah. And it was really weird because when you put the not art in the space, I moved it. And he's like, no, not there. And I'm like, oh, so the not art is not in the right space. It's like this weird inverted conversation.
But that's really interesting thing. Yeah, and that's the interesting thing is that really getting down to what the artist is as an individual and human being and what they want to say. So it's like the invisible things in here, and the reason we're artists is because we want to communicate things that are possibly uncommunicatable through the language, through written language. So you want to be able to talk about it or show a thing. So it's really not for any of us to judge or say what a non-artwork is or what an artwork is. It's for us to experience that and work out how to experience those moments. Because I think practice like Ben's is really interesting. Like my phone call, and hold that. Like you're now part of his work, and you're part of the exhibition at Testing Grounds, which seems a bit naff, but it's really not. It's not in terms of the bigger picture on how we want to try and experience and talk about things. So this kind of ends up being this kind of symbol for the thing.
Also, what if you got, when you want to work out what you say, what if you want to, what you work out what you want to say is that you don't want to say anything? Don't say it. Good answer. Stop talking.
We get really hung up. Sorry, I can talk. I like to talk. We get really hung up about the model of being artists as having to have outcomes, and I think that's a really constricting model. It's really good for some, like you got to work out your function and what you're trying to do. So, you know, if you look at my CV, there's this thing about invisible stuff, which I've been doing for 25 years. I've got a collection of photos of weeds, and I don't know why the fuck I've got it. And there's like 20,000 of them. I don't know why, but I get, you know, and phones are great because my obsession with taking photos of weeds got more and more intense because I had a phone on me all the time. But, you know, that'll say something to me at one point, or it probably has said something to me multiple points through my own career. But I don't have to know why it does, and then doesn't have to be an outcome. It's about you, like, you know, up your ass is what, you know, Diego said. It doesn't fucking matter what people expect of you, it's what you want to be.
I know we're getting close to what you guys have been sitting here for an hour and a half, but we're still quite open to have more questions. Does anyone else at the moment have a question for any of our panellists? We'll go you, and then we'll go you. Sorry. Making you work for it. That's as far as we go.
Okay, all right, I'll just hang out here. I guess my question is probably directed at Alex. This idea of like hybridity, and I guess, you know, you're sort of saying, do your thing, don't worry about what other people say to you, or like, you know, what other people expect and stuff. If you find, like, I'm interested in this, like, the design that you brought to art. My background is ceramics, and it has like quite a specific meaning, and when you put that in an art space, it's sort of contradictory or it's quite difficult. And so I'm sort of interested in when that hybridity kind of is quite difficult, or like, you know, it's difficult to reconcile, like with ceramics. I guess as soon as it's functional, it's almost not art. And I suppose like for you, kind of stepped back completely and sort of put your ideas into what you did. I mean, did you have an experience, or I guess what comments might you make on reconciling design with kind of art, and I don't know, like for yourself finding a way forward?
So I'm in probably a really different position to what you are, in terms of I like the way that a gallery works. That's a space that I feel quite comfortable in, and I like design thinking, but I didn't like designing and the end use of design. Like I didn't like drawing skirts for 12 hours a day that would go on to sell for $1,200, and I didn't like the people that I was selling to. So it was a part of a community and a structure that I didn't want to be involved in anymore, but I liked a really specific component of it that I was able to take away and implement somewhere else. So to answer your question specifically, I would say find that commonality, find what it is that, and in the same way that you guys have been saying, just do what you really love, and it becomes easier to articulate that to other people and make other people care about that. Invest in your own practice. Like, just be really committed to it, because you can find a place for it to sit if you know what you're trying to articulate.
I have something that I have to say. Extending that, the other day I was walking in Preston, which is completely relevant to what I'm about to say. But I was just thinking of what the function of artists, like especially emerging artists in the art world, is, like how they operate in relation to others. And I was thinking, artists are not only broke financially, but also every time an artist does anything, they're actually taking a loan, especially emerging artists, because someone else is putting their trust in you. So you're actually taking a loan. So artists usually have like debts with all these other entities in the art world, whether it's like artist-run spaces, festivals, galleries, other artists. So in terms of developing that trust that Alex is talking about, I think it's actually really important to take care of that trust, because people are investing in you, like not only financially but also culturally, and kind of the reputations are, they're putting their reputations on stake.
Sorry, can I just follow that up with like a kind of obnoxious but also quite relevant conversation I was a part of a little while ago with ceramicist Ramesh Mario. I don't know how to... Yeah, so we were invited to a weird opening of a show at an investment banking corporation. And there were like beautiful works by a super great painter, and Ramesh obviously just like super hot right now, invited as someone who people might want to buy in the future. And we were standing having a conversation with an investment banker, and like we were both like, what the fuck, like this is really uncomfortable, like we're talking about totally different scales of things. And the banker says, oh yeah, I'd really like to buy some work, but we've just got a second mortgage, we've got a new baby, and my wife doesn't want me to be making any other financial outlays. And we're like, oh, mortgages, oh, 2 mortgages, oh, babies. All of this, I don't understand any of this. Like, I've got nothing in common with this. And Ramesh had just gotten like a $50,000 grant, like something like that. It was quite a sizable amount that would make a really big impact on a practice. And he was like, oh, okay, how much, like what are the ratios of like what you invest to what you don't invest? How liquid do you have to be? And I'm like, oh wow, this is very financy kind of talk. And I have nothing to say, so I'm just standing there like really, really blankly, and they're bankers, so they like pretty women. And I'm like, okay, like that's my role in this conversation. I'm just gonna stand still like all of the other women in this room. And then at the end of the conversation, Ramesh goes, oh, that's so weird. I have just spent all of my money from my last grant on my previous show, and I really hope some work sells because otherwise I'm not going to have any more money. And the banker goes, really, like I would never be that, I would never put all of my money in one basket like that. I'm an investment banker, I gamble with people's money for a living, and you were the biggest gambler I've ever met. Like, you are only banking on yourself. So I think artists have a real capacity to do that for themselves. Every day that you go into this studio, you are banking on yourself. So you just have to go big, just do it, because you already are.
I'm going to pass the microphone to Sophie if you'd like to ask your question. Thanks for being so patient.
So I'll direct this at Diego, just because you mentioned post-colonialism. This is loud. Post-colonialism before, and hybridity in terms of art history and curatorship and all these things has often come into play when talking about post-colonialism, particularly like cultural hybridity. And I'm just wondering about how hybridity plays into your specific practice as a post-colonial artist, as you said before that you were. I don't know if you are fully, but could you elaborate?
Well, I'm very non-committal, so I don't know if I am either. Well, I remember one of the first things that surprised me about Australia is people were asking me what percentage it was of like something. And I was like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? Like, I'm not... And, and people, and talking about me like I'm a rabbit, like, oh, do you like this kind of food? Like, like rabbit carrots or... The other one that I think about is like Pokemon. You know how they have like the Digimon and they put that thing onto like Pokemons and they go like the description and everyone is like the fucking same. So I actually don't think much about hybridity, and there was this point in the 90s where they kind of made like a shift from hybridity to syncretism. So syncretism is when, so for example, when an artwork has the appearance of a Western form, but the content is actually something else. You know, for example, Ramesh Mario, he works with syncretic forms. And that has its pros and cons. But I've always been critical of that kind of discourse because there is no way of returning back to anything else. And I'm thinking of Ramesh Mario's sculptures. For example, these are a great example of that, of how there's a clutter with cultural references that is actually hard to distinguish at what point he does that return. And I think the valuable thing about that dynamic is that, well, he never returns to origins. It's always kind of like clutter and messy and really chaotic. So I mean, I just don't think there's much of an advantage of distinguishing, you know, of classifying things as hybrid. I do engage with hybridity in terms like as related to monsters. So, you know, for example, I was thinking today about this. I saw this image of this naked half man, half beast thing crawling in the mountain. It's like this photograph from the 19th century. What's supposed to be found in like Mexico. So it's kind of like an allegory of like the Mexican man. Roar. So you know that's a point where I do engage with hybridity as kind of, which is the undertone of hybridity, like this monstrous intermingling of two things that weren't together, but they were like placed into one. Yeah.